The letter fell from Eleanor's hand the moment she heard her husband's voice behind her, calm and cold, telling her that their marriage was over. She did not turn around at first. She stood by the window of the breakfast room, the morning light falling across the untouched plate in front of her, and she let his words settle over her like a weight she had been expecting for weeks, but had still hoped would never come. "I have spoken with my solicitor," Julian Ashworth said. "The papers will be drawn up by the end of the month. I see no reason to delay what we both already know must happen." Eleanor turned then, slowly, and looked at the man she had married 2 years ago. He stood tall near the doorway, dressed already for the day, his expression unreadable, as though he were discussing the weather, instead of the end of her life as she knew it. "You have decided this without a single word to me," she said quietly. "I am telling you now." "After the papers are already being written." Julian did not answer that. He simply held her gaze, and in his eyes she saw no cruelty, only a tired certainty, as if he had turned this decision over so many times that it no longer felt like a choice at all. She pressed her hand flat against the table to steady herself, not because of his words alone, but because of the secret pressing against her ribs, a secret she had confirmed only that morning, before he had even come down the stairs. She was carrying his child. And he had just told her he wanted her gone. The room felt smaller than it had a moment ago. Somewhere down the hall, she could hear the soft clink of dishes being carried by the servants, ordinary sounds from an ordinary morning, as though the walls of Ashworth House had not just cracked down the middle. "Why?" she asked, though she already knew parts of the answer. She had heard him, 3 nights ago, speaking with his mother in the study, his voice low but not low enough. 2 years, and nothing between us but silence, he had said. "I married a stranger, and a stranger she remains." "You know why," Julian said now. "We married because our fathers wished it. We have done our duty by appearing together in society. But this is not a marriage, Eleanor. It has never been one. And you believe ending it will make things simpler. I believe it will make things honest." The word struck her harder than she expected. Honest, as if she had been the one hiding something all this time, when in truth it was he who had hidden his plans, discussed them with lawyers and with his own mother before ever speaking to his wife. She thought, in that moment, of telling him. The words rose to her throat, ready to be spoken. "I am carrying your child," but she stopped herself, because she could already imagine his face changing, not with joy, but with suspicion. She had heard enough about men in his position, men who feared being trapped by a wife they no longer wanted, to know how quickly love could be doubted when convenience was involved. If she told him now, would he believe her, or would he think she had waited for this exact moment, this exact conversation, to use the child as a weapon against the very freedom he was trying to claim? She swallowed the words back down. "When did you decide this?" she asked instead. "Weeks ago. And you said nothing. I am saying it now." Eleanor let out a breath that shook more than she wanted it to. She thought of the wedding night 2 years past, the one night when something had passed between them that had felt almost real, a gentleness in his hands, a warmth in his voice that she had held on to in the quiet months that followed, even as the distance between them grew wider with each passing season. She had believed, foolishly perhaps, that warmth could return, that duty could soften into something more, given time. She understood now that she had been waiting for a future that Julian had already decided would not exist. "I will not fight you," she said finally, lifting her chin, "but do not expect me to make this easy for you either." Something flickered across his face then, something she could not name, gone before she could study it. "I never expected ease," he said. "Only an end." He left the room without another word, his boots striking the polished floor in a steady rhythm that faded down the corridor, leaving Eleanor alone with the cold breakfast, the fallen letter, and the truth she had not spoken. She sank into her chair and pressed both hands against her stomach, where no one could yet see the change that was coming, the change that would alter everything, whether Julian wanted it or not. Outside the breakfast room, in the shadow of the hallway, Lady Constance Vale had heard every word. She pressed herself against the wall, a small, satisfied smile curving her lips as she listened to Julian's footsteps retreat toward his study. She had waited a long time for this morning, had planted careful words in Julian's ear for months, small doubts about Eleanor's coldness, her distance, her unsuitability for a house as grand as Ashworth. She had not expected results so soon, nor so complete. An annulment, freedom for Julian, and an opening, at last, for her own daughter, waiting patiently at their family estate, to be introduced properly into society as the future mistress of Ashworth House. Constance smoothed the front of her gown, and walked calmly toward the drawing room, humming softly to herself, already composing the letter she would send that very afternoon. Upstairs in the West Wing, Dowager Duchess Margaret sat by her window with a cup of tea slowly growing cold in her hands. She had heard the raised voices earlier, faint through the old stone walls of the house, and though she could not make out every word, she understood enough. Her son had made his decision. She set the cup down with a soft clink and folded her hands in her lap. She did not believe, not for a moment, that her son's coldness toward his wife was simply a matter of duty and distance. She had watched him on his wedding day, had seen the way his eyes had softened when he looked at Eleanor, however briefly, however long ago that now felt. Something had happened since then to harden him, and she suspected it had less to do with Eleanor, and more to do with the whispers that had been finding their way into his ear for months. Whispers she was almost certain came from Constance. Margaret rose from her chair and walked to the door, deciding that today, she would pay her daughter-in-law a visit, whether Eleanor wished for company or not. Downstairs, in the small physician's room at the edge of the east corridor, Dr. Alistair Grant packed away his instruments after examining a servant's minor injury, unaware that within the hour, he would be called to attend to the Duchess herself, and unaware of the secret he was about to become bound to keep. Eleanor remained in the breakfast room a long while after Julian had gone, staring at nothing, her mind turning over every possible path forward. She could tell him and risk his disbelief. She could stay silent and risk him discovering the truth from someone else, in some other way, at some worse time. She thought of Constance's frequent visits over the past months, the two friendly smiles that never quite reached her eyes, the comments made in passing about how tiring marriage could become when there was no true affection to sustain it. Eleanor had never trusted her husband's cousin, not from the very first meeting, though she had never been able to prove her instincts correct. Now, watching the empty doorway where Julian had stood, she wondered how much of his sudden certainty had been his own, and how much had been carefully placed there by someone else. A soft knock came at the door. Eleanor straightened quickly, wiping any trace of distress from her face before answering. "Come in." It was Hannah, one of the younger maids, carrying a fresh pot of tea and a look of quiet concern. "Your Grace, are you unwell? You look pale this morning." Eleanor managed a small smile. "Only tired, Hannah. Nothing more." But as the maid set down the tray and quietly withdrew, Eleanor pressed a hand once more to her stomach and made a silent promise to the child she carried. A promise that no matter what her husband decided, no matter what battles lay ahead within the walls of this grand and cold house, she would not let this child grow up unwanted, unclaimed, or unloved. Whatever came next, she would face it. Later that morning, Eleanor made her way to the small sitting room that overlooked the eastern gardens, a place she had claimed as her own during the first hopeful weeks of her marriage, when she still believed this house might one day feel like home rather than a beautiful cage. She sat by the window with a piece of needlework in her lap, though her hands remained still, her mind too crowded with worry to focus on the careful stitches. From here, she could see the edge of the stables, where Julian had gone to inspect a new mare recently purchased for the estate. She watched him for a moment, his figure small and distant against the gray morning, and felt a strange ache settle in her chest, grief for something she had never quite managed to hold, even in the brief months when she had believed it might be within reach. She thought back to the early days of their marriage, when Julian had still made an effort, small gestures that had meant more to her than he likely realized. He had once brought her a book from London simply because she had mentioned enjoying the author during a dinner conversation. He had once sat with her for an entire afternoon while she recovered from a mild fever, reading aloud from a volume of poetry in a voice that had, for those few hours, sounded almost tender. She did not know what had changed. She had turned the question over countless times in the months since, searching for some fault of her own that might explain his growing distance, some misstep she had made without realizing it. She had never found an answer that satisfied her, and now, faced with the reality of his decision, she wondered if there had ever truly been a single answer to find, or if the coldness had simply grown the way frost grows across a window pane, slow and unnoticed until the whole surface is covered. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Margaret entered without waiting for a full invitation, a habit she had developed over the 2 years of Eleanor's marriage into the family, one that Eleanor had come to find comforting rather than intrusive. "I heard raised voices earlier," Margaret said, settling into the chair across from her. "Or rather, I heard my son's voice, and the particular silence that follows when he has said something he believes to be final." Eleanor set down her needlework. "He told me he intends to end our marriage. He has already begun consulting his solicitor." Margaret's expression did not shift with surprise, only with a weary sort of sadness that suggested she had feared this outcome for some time. I am sorry, my dear, truly. You are not surprised. I have watched him grow more distant these past months, and I have my own suspicions as to why, though I cannot yet prove them. Margaret reached over and took Eleanor's hand gently. Whatever happens in the days ahead, know that you have not lost my regard, nor my support, regardless of what my son decides. Eleanor managed a small, grateful smile, though the weight in her chest did not lift. She wanted, desperately, to tell Margaret the truth of what she carried, to share the burden with someone who might offer comfort rather than judgment. But the words would not come, not yet, not while everything still felt so fragile and uncertain. She simply did not yet know how much sooner that reckoning would arrive than she expected, nor how many people within Ashworth House were already moving pieces on a board she could not yet see. Eleanor spent the following days learning how to hide a secret in plain sight. She rose earlier than usual, before the nausea could catch her unaware in front of the household staff. She wore looser gowns and claimed the change was simply a preference for comfort. She declined invitations to ride, saying the weather did not suit her, and turned away offers of wine at dinner with a polite smile and a claim that her stomach had been delicate lately. Julian noticed none of it. He had already begun to withdraw from the daily rhythms of the house, spending long hours in his study, or riding out to inspect the estate's northern fields, returning only for dinner, where conversation between them had shrunk to a handful of necessary words. It was during one of these quiet dinners that Eleanor first felt the sickness rise without warning. She excused herself abruptly, her napkin falling from her lap, and hurried from the dining room before anyone could see her face go pale. She did not make it far. In the hallway outside, she pressed a hand against the wall and breathed slowly until the worst of it passed, unaware that Dr. Alistair Grant, summoned earlier that evening to check on an ailing groundskeeper, was walking the same corridor and had witnessed the entire moment. "Your Grace," he said gently, stepping closer. "Are you unwell?" Eleanor straightened at once, smoothing her skirts. "It is nothing, doctor, a passing discomfort," but Alistair had spent enough years treating the women of great houses to recognize the particular pallor in her cheeks, the way her hand had gone instinctively to her stomach before she caught herself and lowered it again. "Forgive my boldness," he said quietly, "but I do not think it is nothing." Eleanor's eyes flicked to the empty hallway, then back to him. There was no one else near, only the soft glow of candlelight along the walls and the distant murmur of servants clearing the dining room. "If I ask you to keep something in confidence," she said slowly, "as my physician and nothing more, would you honor that request? Always?" She hesitated only a moment longer before the truth slipped free, quiet and trembling. "I am with child." Alistair did not react with shock, only with the careful, measured calm of a man accustomed to holding delicate information. "How far along, would you say?" "Perhaps 2 months." He nodded slowly, already turning over the medical details in his mind. But beneath that professional calm, another thought pressed forward, one he could not ignore. "Your Grace, forgive me, but does the Duke know?" Eleanor's silence answered before her words did. "He does not." "May I ask why?" She turned toward the window at the end of the hall, looking out at the dark gardens beyond the glass. "Because he has already decided to end our marriage, Doctor. He told me himself, only days ago. If I tell him now, about this, he will believe I am using the child to change his mind. He will think I am trapping him, the way men of his station often fear being trapped. And if you do not tell him, then at least whatever choice he makes, he will have made it honestly, without a child forced into the decision." Alistair studied her for a long moment, torn between the loyalty a physician owed his patient and the growing unease he felt at keeping such news from a man who, whatever his faults, deserved to know he was soon to be a father. "I understand your reasoning," he said carefully. "But secrets in houses like this one rarely stay secrets for long. I would rather you tell him in your own time and your own words than have him learn it by accident, or worse, from someone else." Eleanor's expression tightened. "You are thinking of Lady Constance. I have noticed she takes a great interest in matters that are not entirely her own." "As have I," Eleanor admitted, "though I cannot yet prove what I suspect." Alistair inclined his head. "Then let us proceed carefully. I will say nothing, as you have asked. But I urge you, Your Grace, do not wait too long. The longer you carry this alone, the harder the telling will become, and the more damage a discovery by someone else could do." Eleanor thanked him quietly and returned to her chambers that night, with his warning sitting heavily in her chest. In the days that followed, her mind often drifted back to the early months of her marriage, to memories she had folded away and rarely allowed herself to revisit. She remembered her wedding night, the candlelit room, the nervous silence between two people who barely knew each other, and then the surprising gentleness of Julian's hands as he had drawn her close, the low warmth in his voice when he told her she had nothing to fear from him. For a brief time after that, she had believed something real might grow between them. She remembered mornings when he had lingered at breakfast simply to speak with her, evenings when he had asked after her day with what seemed like genuine interest. She remembered thinking, foolishly perhaps, that duty had only been the beginning, and love might follow in its own time. Then, slowly, without any single moment she could point to as the turning point, he had begun to pull away. His visits to her chambers grew rare, then stopped altogether. His conversations at dinner shortened to polite necessities. She had told herself it was simply the demands of managing a great estate, the pressures of his position, but she now understood, listening to him speak of solicitors and annulments, that something else had been working against her in the shadows. She thought of Constance's frequent visits during those very months when Julian's warmth had begun to fade. The timing, she realized now, was not a coincidence. One afternoon, seeking distraction from her own thoughts, Eleanor walked the garden paths behind the house and came upon the Dowager Duchess Margaret seated on a stone bench near the roses, a book open but unread in her lap. "Eleanor," Margaret said warmly, patting the space beside her. "Come, sit with me a moment." Eleanor obliged, grateful for the older woman's steady presence, one of the few in the household she had come to trust. "You look tired, my dear," Margaret said, studying her closely, more tired than a simple lack of sleep would explain. Eleanor forced a smile. "It has been a difficult week." "So I have heard," Margaret's voice softened. "My son can be a fool, Eleanor, though I love him dearly. He has always struggled to trust easily, ever since his father passed and left him a house full of responsibilities and very few people he could rely upon without question." "I did not know that." "He does not speak of it, but I have watched him grow more guarded with every year, and I fear certain people have learned to use that guardedness against him." Margaret's gaze sharpened slightly. "I do not trust Constance, if I am honest with you. I have not trusted her for some time." Eleanor's pulse quickened at the confirmation of her own suspicions, but she said nothing of the child growing within her, not yet ready to place that trust in anyone, even Margaret. "Whatever happens between you and Julian," Margaret continued, "know that this house has never truly felt like a home to me until you came into it. I would be sorry to see that change." The words settled over Eleanor like a small comfort in an otherwise uncertain week, though she could not yet know how much would shift before the two of them spoke so plainly again. That evening in his study, Julian sat across from his solicitor, a stack of papers between them outlining the formal steps required to dissolve a marriage of his standing. The process would not be simple, nor quick, but it was, according to the solicitor, entirely possible given the circumstances Julian described, a marriage lacking in the affections generally expected between husband and wife. Julian signed the first of the preliminary documents with a steady hand, though something in his chest tightened as the ink dried on the page, a feeling he chose not to examine too closely. Down the hall, unseen by either of them, Lady Constance passed by the study door and caught the low murmur of voices within. She smiled to herself and continued on toward her rooms, already certain the matter was progressing exactly as she had hoped. Julian, for his part, had not gone looking for reasons to doubt his wife. He told himself this as he sat alone later that night, a glass of brandy untouched at his elbow, the fire burning low in the grate. He had never been a suspicious man by nature, had never gone searching for slights or hidden meanings in the words of those around him, but something about the way certain comments had reached him over recent weeks, gentle and reluctant in their delivery, as though reluctant to burden him with such observations, had settled into his mind and refused to leave. He thought of his father, briefly, a man who had built the Ashworth fortune through careful caution, through never trusting a situation until it had proven itself many times over. Julian had inherited that caution along with the title, had carried it through every business dealing and social alliance since his father's passing, and he told himself now that applying the same principle to his marriage was simply prudent, not unkind. Yet even as he reasoned this through, some small, quieter part of his mind resisted, recalling instead the early months of his marriage, when Eleanor's presence in a room had felt like warmth rather than obligation, when her quiet observations over dinner had often surprised him with their wit, when he had found himself, more than once, looking forward to her company rather than merely enduring it. He did not know precisely when that warmth had begun to fade, nor could he clearly recall the moment he had stopped seeking her out in the evenings, had stopped lingering at breakfast simply to hear her thoughts on the day ahead. He only knew that somewhere along the way, distance had crept in, and once it had taken hold, it seemed to grow of its own accord, fed by silences neither of them seemed able to break. He rose from his chair and paced slowly toward the window overlooking the darkened gardens below. Somewhere in that great house, his wife carried a secret he could not begin to guess at, and he carried doubts planted by someone he trusted far more than he perhaps should have. Neither of them, in that quiet hour, understood how close their two secrets stood to colliding, nor how much pain might have been spared had either chosen honesty over caution, before pride had time to take root. The following morning, Eleanor woke earlier than usual, roused by a soft, persistent ache low in her back that Dr. Grant later assured her was common enough in early pregnancy and no cause for alarm. She lay in bed a while longer than she intended, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant sounds of the household stirring to life below, servants moving through corridors, the soft clatter of the kitchen preparing the morning meal, ordinary sounds that felt, on this particular morning, almost unbearably heavy with the weight of everything she was not saying. She thought of her own mother, gone now 3 years, and wondered what advice she might have offered in a situation such as this. Her mother had married for love, a rare enough thing among families of their standing, and had often spoken to Eleanor as a young girl about the importance of honesty within a marriage, of never allowing pride to build walls that affection could not later tear down. Eleanor had carried those words with her into her own arranged match, had hoped, in her own quiet way, that honesty might eventually bridge the gap between duty and genuine feeling. She wondered now, lying alone in the gray morning light, whether she had failed to honor her mother's counsel, or whether circumstances beyond her control had simply made honesty an impossible luxury. She did not have an answer. She only knew that the longer she waited, the heavier the eventual telling would become, and somewhere beneath her fear, a small, stubborn hope remained that when the moment finally came, Julian might surprise her. She rose eventually and dressed with Hannah's quiet assistance, choosing a gown loose enough to conceal the faint changes already beginning in her figure, changes she knew would not remain hidden for many more weeks. As Hannah fastened the final buttons along her back, Eleanor caught the maid's reflection in the mirror and noticed the careful way the young woman avoided commenting on the fit of the gown, though her eyes lingered a moment longer than necessary. "You need not worry yourself over my choice of dress, Hannah," Eleanor said gently, offering the girl an easy path away from any awkward questions. "Of course, Your Grace," Hannah replied, though something in her tone suggested she had already guessed more than she let on. The staff of a great house, Eleanor reminded herself, saw far more than their employers often realized, and kept far more silent than they were given credit for. She wondered how many others below stairs had already begun to suspect what she had not yet spoken aloud to her own husband. She made her way down to the breakfast room that morning, determined to face Julian with some measure of composure, only to find the room empty, a note left on the table informing her that he had ridden out early to the northern fields and would not return until evening. Relief and disappointment mingled uncomfortably in her chest. Relief that she would not have to maintain her careful mask through another silent meal. Disappointment that even now, some small part of her still hoped for a moment of connection that never seemed to arrive. She ate alone, the quiet of the room broken only by the soft sounds of servants moving through the house, and resolved, as she often did in those difficult weeks, to simply endure one day at a time, trusting that clarity would eventually come, even if she could not yet see the shape it might take. The first true blow came on a rainy afternoon, when Julian summoned Eleanor to his study with a note carried by one of the footmen, its tone formal enough that she knew before entering the room that this would not be a gentle conversation. She found him standing near the window, watching the rain streak down the glass, his back to the door. "You wish to see me," she said, closing the door behind her. He turned slowly. "I did. I have heard something today that I would like you to explain." Eleanor's stomach tightened, though not from the sickness this time. "Explain what?" "That you have been meeting privately with Dr. Grant. More than once, alone." For a moment, Eleanor could not find words. She had expected many things from this conversation. Questions about the annulment, perhaps even a final farewell speech rehearsed in advance, but not this. "He is a physician," she said carefully. "I have been unwell." "Unwell how?" "That is a private matter between myself and my doctor." Julian's jaw tightened, and for the first time since he had announced his decision to end their marriage, Eleanor saw something other than cold certainty in his eyes. She saw doubt, and beneath the doubt, something that looked almost like hurt, quickly buried beneath suspicion. "You ask me to trust your discretion," he said, "while offering none of your own. Do you understand how this appears, Eleanor? A wife who avoids her husband's company yet finds time for private meetings with another man. In hallways, in the evening, more than once? It is not what you are suggesting. Then tell me what it is. The truth pressed against her lips, desperate to be spoken. She wanted, more than anything, to simply say the words and end the misunderstanding before it could grow any larger. But the memory of his cold announcement over breakfast still stung too fresh, and a new fear had crept in alongside it. The fear that if she told him now, in the middle of an argument born from suspicion, he would never fully believe the timing was innocent. I cannot tell you, she said instead, not yet. Julian's expression hardened into something colder than she had seen from him before. Cannot or will not? Does it matter which? It matters to me whether my wife is being honest or simply careful about which lies she chooses to tell. The accusation struck harder than she expected, and something in her chest cracked. I have never lied to you, Julian. You have kept secrets. In my experience, that amounts to the same thing. Then perhaps you should ask yourself why a wife might feel the need to keep secrets from a husband who has already decided to discard her, Eleanor said, her voice rising despite her effort to keep it steady. You did not consult me on the matter of ending this marriage. You consulted your solicitor. Do not lecture me on honesty when you have shown so little of it yourself. Silence fell between them, heavy and sharp. Julian's expression flickered, something almost like regret passing behind his eyes, but he did not soften his words. This conversation is finished, he said quietly. I expect you will consider carefully what continuing to meet privately with the doctor might mean for how these proceedings are viewed. Eleanor left the study with her hands trembling, more from anger now than fear, and made her way to her chambers, where she sat by the window and allowed herself, finally, a few quiet tears. She remained there for a long while, watching the rain continue its steady descent against the glass, before a soft knock drew her attention. She expected Hannah, perhaps come to check on her, and was surprised instead to find the Dowager Duchess standing in the doorway, her expression carrying a quiet concern that Eleanor had come to recognize and trust over the past months. I heard voices from the study earlier, Margaret said, stepping inside without waiting for a formal invitation. I do not wish to pry, but you look as though the conversation did not go well. Eleanor wiped quickly at her eyes, embarrassed to be caught in such a state. It is nothing, truly. Eleanor. Margaret's voice held a gentle firmness that made it difficult to maintain the pretense. I have lived in this house a great many years. I know the particular silence that follows an argument, and I know the particular exhaustion that follows carrying a burden too heavy to be carried alone. You have both, I think, in equal measure. Eleanor's composure wavered further under the older woman's steady, kind gaze. For a moment, she considered telling her everything, the pregnancy, her fears, her growing suspicion of Constance's involvement in the widening rift between herself and Julian. But the words caught in her throat, held back by weeks of careful secrecy that had become almost a reflex by now. Julian believes I have been improper with Dr. Grant, she said instead, choosing the smaller truth over the larger one. He believes our private conversations mean something they do not. Margaret's expression sharpened with something close to anger. That is a serious accusation to level against a wife who has given him no true cause for such suspicion. Where would such an idea come from? I do not know, Eleanor said carefully, though privately she suspected the answer all too well. I have my own thoughts on the matter, Margaret said, her tone measured but firm, and I intend to watch more closely in the days ahead. This house has enough sorrow within it already, Eleanor, without additional lies being woven into its walls by those who ought to know better. She stayed with Eleanor a while longer, offering quiet company rather than further questions, and though Eleanor said nothing more of the true nature of her secret, she found herself grateful, in that difficult hour, for the steady presence of a woman who had become, in many ways, more of a mother to her than her own family had managed to be in recent years. She did not yet know that the rumor reaching Julian's ears that afternoon had not come from an innocent observation by a servant, but from a carefully worded comment planted by Lady Constance during a private conversation with Julian only hours earlier, a comment designed to look like concern while sowing exactly the kind of doubt that had just poisoned the room. Constance had chosen her words with practiced care. I only mention it, cousin, because I would hate for you to be made a fool of twice over, first by a cold marriage and then by whispers you did not see coming. She had watched Julian's face carefully as she spoke, satisfied by the way his expression had shifted from mild interest to genuine concern. It had taken remarkably little effort to turn a physician's routine visits into something far more damaging in Julian's mind. That evening, Dr. Alistair Grant returned to Ashworth House to check on Eleanor's condition, and found her subdued, her eyes red-rimmed though she tried to hide it. "Your Grace, has something happened?" "The Duke believes there is something improper between us," Eleanor said flatly. "Someone has been watching our meetings and reporting them in the worst possible light." Alistair's expression darkened. "I feared something like this might happen. I should have insisted on more discretion." "It is not your fault, Doctor. It is the fault of someone determined to see this marriage end, whatever the cost to the truth." "Constance," Alistair said quietly. "I have no proof. Nor do I, but I have watched her long enough in this house to trust my instincts on the matter." Eleanor pressed a hand to her stomach, the small curve barely noticeable beneath her gown but growing with each passing week. "I cannot keep hiding this much longer, Doctor. But if I tell him now, in the middle of accusations and suspicion, he will never believe my timing was anything but calculated." "Then perhaps," Alistair said slowly, "you must find the right moment before someone else finds it for you." Eleanor nodded, though she did not yet know how such a moment might arrive, nor how little time remained before it did. Elsewhere in the house, Dowager Duchess Margaret had begun her own quiet investigation. She had noticed the sudden coldness following Julian's meeting with his solicitor, had noticed too the timing of Constance's visits, always arriving with some small comment or piece of gossip shortly before Julian's mood darkened further. She said nothing outright, not yet, but she began watching her niece by marriage far more carefully, cataloging small moments that, taken alone, meant little, but gathered together, painted a troubling picture. She found Constance in the drawing room one evening, embroidering by candlelight with the calm expression of a woman entirely at peace with herself. "You seem well settled here lately," Margaret said, taking the seat across from her. "I only wish to help however I can, during such a difficult time for the family," Constance replied smoothly. "How thoughtful," Margaret said, her tone giving nothing away. "Tell me, dear, how is your daughter faring at your family's estate? I understand she has grown into quite an accomplished young woman." Something flickered across Constance's face, gone almost as quickly as it appeared, but Margaret had seen it, the faint tightening around the eyes of a woman calculating how much had been guessed. "She is well, thank you," Constance said carefully, "though of course a young woman's prospects depend greatly on circumstance and opportunity." "Indeed they do," Margaret agreed, rising from her chair with the unhurried grace of a woman who had learned patience over many long years. "One never knows how circumstances might shift, do they? Sometimes quite suddenly." She left the room without another word, leaving Constance to sit alone with her embroidery and the uncomfortable feeling that she had just been seen far more clearly than she preferred. Constance sat motionless for several minutes after Margaret's departure, her needle still against the half-finished pattern in her lap, her mind turning over the exchange with growing unease. She had always known the Dowager Duchess to be sharper than most gave her credit for, a woman who observed far more than she commented upon, and Constance had grown careless in recent weeks, confident that her careful manipulations had gone unnoticed beneath the larger drama unfolding between Julian and his wife. She set aside her embroidery and rose, moving to the window that overlooked the front drive, watching the rain continue its steady fall across the gravel path below. Her daughter's future depended on the coming weeks unfolding precisely as planned, and she could not afford missteps now, not when she had come so close to securing the outcome she had spent so many months carefully arranging. She thought back to the early days of her scheme, the casual comments dropped during visits to Ashworth House, small observations about Eleanor's coldness, her unsuitability for a household of such standing, comments carefully worded to sound like concern rather than criticism. Julian had been an easy enough target for such suggestions, guarded by nature and already inclined toward doubt after years of managing an estate without a father's guidance to steady him. It had taken remarkably little effort to nudge his uncertainty toward outright suspicion. But Margaret was proving a more difficult obstacle than Constance had anticipated, and the physician's continued presence in the house, along with his obvious loyalty to Eleanor, presented complications she had not fully accounted for when she began her careful campaign months earlier. She resolved, standing there by the window, that she would need to move more decisively in the days ahead, before suspicion could harden into certainty, and before whatever secret Eleanor was so carefully guarding had the chance to surface on its own terms rather than hers. She did not yet know how little time remained before that secret would surface regardless of her efforts, nor how catastrophically her careful plans were about to unravel. That evening, Julian dined alone in his study rather than joining the family table, a decision that did not go unnoticed by the staff, who exchanged quiet glances as they carried trays up the stairs instead of setting the long dining table below. He sat with a plate largely untouched before him, his mind still turning over the confrontation with Eleanor earlier that day. replaying her words in a loop he could not quite silence. Perhaps you should ask yourself why a wife might feel the need to keep secrets from a husband who has already decided to discard her. The accusation stung more than he wanted to admit, in part because he recognized some truth within it. He had made his decision to end the marriage without ever truly consulting Eleanor's thoughts on the matter, had assumed her indifference matched his own growing distance, without ever asking whether that assumption held any merit. He had told himself in the weeks leading up to his announcement that he was simply being practical, sparing them both a prolonged unhappiness neither of them had chosen. But sitting alone now with his cooling dinner and his restless thoughts, he wondered whether practicality had simply been a convenient shield for something closer to fear. Fear of vulnerability, fear of trusting a woman he barely understood, fear inherited perhaps from a father who had rarely shown affection openly and had taught his son, through example rather than words, that sentiment was a weakness best kept private. He thought of his father often in moments like these, a man who had run Ashworth House with careful, unemotional precision, who had arranged Julian's marriage as he might arrange any other business matter, weighing lineage and connections and dowries with the same careful calculation he applied to matters of trade and investment. Julian had never questioned that approach as a young man, had accepted it as simply the way such things were done among families of their standing. It was only now, faced with the reality of ending a marriage that had, in its early months, shown flickers of something warmer than mere arrangement, that he found himself questioning whether his father's cold precision had truly served him well, or whether it had simply taught his son to guard against feeling anything at all. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. He expected a servant come to collect his largely untouched plate, and was mildly surprised instead to find his mother standing in the doorway, her expression carrying the particular firmness she reserved for conversations she considered important. "You did not join us for dinner," Margaret said, stepping inside without waiting for invitation, a habit she shared, Julian noted, with Eleanor, though he had never thought to compare the two women so directly before this moment. "I was not hungry." Nor, I suspect, was Eleanor, though for entirely different reasons than you might assume. Margaret settled into the chair across from his desk, folding her hands in her lap with the composed patience of a woman prepared to wait as long as necessary for her son to hear what she had to say. "Julian, I must ask you something, and I would ask that you answer honestly." "Of course. Do you truly believe your wife capable of the impropriety you accused her of this afternoon? Truly, in your heart, setting aside whatever doubts have been whispered into your ear these past weeks?" Julian hesitated, the question landing with more weight than he expected. He thought of Eleanor's face during their confrontation, the hurt beneath her anger, the proud refusal to explain herself even when explanation might have eased the tension between them. He thought of 2 years of marriage, of a woman who had never once given him cause, before recent weeks, to doubt her character or her loyalty to the household she had married into. "No," he admitted quietly, "I do not truly believe it." "Then why accuse her of it?" "Because the doubt was there, regardless of what I believed underneath it. Because I could not account for her private meetings with the doctor, and the uncertainty gnawed at me until I said something I should not have said." Margaret studied him for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind her eyes. "And has it occurred to you, my son, that a woman with nothing to hide might still have reasons for privacy that have nothing at all to do with impropriety?" "What reasons?" "That is not mine to say," Margaret replied carefully. "But I would ask you to consider, before you finalize anything further with your solicitor, whether the doubts guiding your decisions these past weeks have truly been your own, or whether they have been carefully placed there by someone with reasons of their own for wanting this marriage to end." She left him with that question hanging in the quiet study, the fire burning low, his dinner cold and forgotten on the desk before him, and for the first time since he had announced his decision to end his marriage, Julian found himself genuinely uncertain whether that decision had ever truly been his own. The days following the confrontation in Julian's study settled into a strained and careful silence between husband and wife, the kind that filled every shared meal with the sound of cutlery against china and little else. Eleanor kept to her chambers more often now, claiming fatigue, though the truth was closer to exhaustion, both from the growing demands of the child within her and the constant effort of holding two lives apart, the life Julian saw and the life she carried in secret. Margaret watched her daughter-in-law grow paler by the week and grew more certain that something beyond a failing marriage was troubling her, though Eleanor continued to deflect every gentle question with practiced ease. It was on a gray morning, nearly a week after the confrontation, that Eleanor's careful balance finally broke. She had risen early, intending to walk the garden before the household stirred, hoping the fresh air might settle the persistent nausea that had grown worse in recent days. She made it only as far as the second-floor landing before her vision blurred at the edges and her legs gave way beneath her. She did not remember falling. She remembered only Hannah's frightened voice calling for help, and then darkness. When she woke, she was in her own bed, the curtains drawn against the morning light, and Dr. Alistair Grant sat beside her, his expression grave with concern. "Your Grace, you gave us quite a fright," he said gently. "You fainted on the landing. Fortunately, one of the maids was nearby." Eleanor's hand went immediately to her stomach. "The child?" "Resting, as far as I can tell, though I would like you to remain in bed for the coming days. You have been pushing yourself too hard, hiding too much strain. This cannot continue, Your Grace." Before Eleanor could respond, the door opened, and Dowager Duchess Margaret entered, her face pale with worry. Behind her stood two of the household staff, drawn by the commotion, and further back, lingering near the doorway with poorly concealed interest, stood Lady Constance. "What happened?" Margaret asked urgently, moving to the bedside. Alistair hesitated, glancing at Eleanor, who lay too weak and too caught off guard to stop what came next. "Your daughter-in-law fainted from exhaustion," Alistair said carefully, choosing his words with what remaining discretion he could manage. "The strain of recent weeks, combined with the early stages of pregnancy, has taken a heavy toll on her strength." The room fell utterly silent. Margaret's eyes widened, moving quickly from Alistair's face to Eleanor's, disbelief and dawning understanding crossing her features in the span of a single breath. "Pregnancy," she repeated softly. Eleanor closed her eyes. The secret she had guarded so carefully now laid bare in the worst possible circumstances, spoken not by her own voice, not in her own time, but by accident, in front of witnesses she had never intended to include, and worst of all, without Julian present to hear it from her. Near the doorway, Constance's expression shifted rapidly from surprise to something far more calculating. She said nothing, offered no comment, simply turned and slipped quietly from the room, while the others remained focused on Eleanor. "Does Julian know?" Margaret asked, once the door had closed and only Eleanor, Margaret, and Alistair remained in the room. "No," Eleanor whispered. "I wanted to tell him myself, in my own time. Not like this." Margaret sat carefully on the edge of the bed and took Eleanor's hand in both of hers. "My dear girl, why would you carry such a burden alone?" "Because he had already decided to end our marriage before I even knew about the child," Eleanor said, her voice breaking at last after weeks of careful composure. "How could I tell him after that, without him believing I meant to trap him with it? I wanted him to know the truth, not suspect a manipulation." Margaret's expression softened with understanding, though worry still lined her features. "Whatever his fears, my son deserves to know he is to be a father, Eleanor. And you deserve better than to carry this weight in silence, fearing his judgment." "I know that now," Eleanor admitted, "but it may already be too late to tell him in my own words." Her fear was well-founded. Constance moved quickly once she left Eleanor's chambers, her mind racing through the implications of what she had just overheard. A child changed everything. If Julian learned of the pregnancy before the annulment proceedings concluded, he might reconsider the entire matter, and years of careful positioning, months of patient whispers designed to secure her own daughter's future within this family, would collapse entirely. She needed time, and more importantly, she needed to control how and when Julian received this information, if he received it at all, before matters progressed too far to be undone. She found Julian in the stables, inspecting a new mare recently acquired for the estate, his attention fully absorbed in the animal, until Constance's approach drew his eye. "Cousin," she said, her voice carrying just the right note of concern, "I wish to speak with you, though I fear what I must say will be difficult to hear." Julian straightened, sensing immediately the seriousness in her tone. "What is it?" "There was some commotion in the house this morning. Eleanor fainted on the landing." She paused, watching his face carefully for the flicker of concern she expected and received. "The doctor attended her quickly, and she is resting now. I am told she will recover." Relief crossed Julian's face before he could mask it, a reaction that told Constance more than she wished to know about the true state of his feelings, buried though they were beneath weeks of cold determination. "I should go to her," he said. "Of course," Constance replied smoothly. "Though I should mention, cousin, the household staff seem quite concerned about the strain she has been under lately. Perhaps the stress of the recent proceedings has proven too much for her. It might be wise to proceed carefully, and quickly, before matters grow any more complicated for everyone involved." It was a carefully constructed suggestion, urging haste in the very proceedings that would end the marriage before Julian could learn the full truth of Eleanor's condition. And Julian, still processing the news of her collapse, did not yet see the manipulation woven through Constance's words. "Perhaps you are right," he said slowly, though something in his chest resisted the thought even as he spoke it. He left the stables and made his way toward the house, his steps quickening with each passing moment, driven by a concern he told himself was simply the natural response of any husband learning his wife had collapsed, nothing more. But as he climbed the stairs toward Eleanor's chambers, he found the door closed, and Margaret standing just outside it, her expression unusually guarded when she looked at her son. "She is resting," Margaret said carefully. "I do not think now is the best time to disturb her. I only wish to see that she is well." "She is well, Julian, or she will be, given rest and the freedom from further stress." Margaret studied her son's face for a long moment, weighing something in her mind that she had not yet decided how to share. "There are things happening in this house that you do not fully understand, my son. I would ask that you be patient, just a little longer, before you finalize anything with your solicitor." Julian frowned, confusion mixing with the lingering worry from the morning's events. "What things?" "Not today," Margaret said gently. "When the time is right, you will understand everything. For now, simply know that your wife needs rest, and perhaps more patience from you than you have shown her these past weeks." She left him standing outside the closed door, uncertainty settling over him in a way he had not felt since the earliest, most confusing days of his arranged marriage, when he had first begun to wonder if the quiet, dignified woman he had married held more depth than he had ever taken the time to discover. Julian remained in the corridor a long while after his mother had gone, staring at the closed door as though it might yield answers simply through persistence. He thought of Eleanor's collapse, the fear that had gripped him in the stables upon hearing the news, a fear far sharper and more immediate than he had expected to feel for a woman he had, only days earlier, been prepared to release from their marriage entirely. He did not examine that contradiction too closely, uncertain what he might find if he did. He made his way instead to his study, though he found no peace there either, his mind circling restlessly around the fragments of information gathered throughout the day. Eleanor unwell, his mother speaking in careful riddles, Constance urging haste in matters he had, until recently, felt entirely certain about. Nothing quite fit together, and the pieces that did suggest a shape he was not yet ready to fully consider. He poured himself a drink he did not truly want, and sat by the cold hearth, waiting for the fire to catch, his thoughts drifting back across the 2 years of his marriage, with a scrutiny he had rarely allowed himself before. He remembered the early weeks, the cautious getting to know one another that had characterized those first months. Two strangers learning to share a household, a name, a future neither had fully chosen for themselves. He remembered moments of unexpected ease, conversations that had run longer than either of them intended, comfortable silences that had felt, at the time, like the beginnings of something genuine rather than mere tolerance. He remembered, too, the slow creep of distance that had followed, though he found now that he could not clearly identify its cause. Had it been his own growing preoccupation with estate matters, the endless demands of maintaining Ashworth's fortunes that had pulled him increasingly into his study and away from his wife's company? Had it been Eleanor's own quiet withdrawal, a response perhaps to some slight he had never noticed committing? Or had it been something else entirely, some outside influence working quietly to widen a gap that might otherwise have closed on its own, given time and patience? He did not have answers, only questions that multiplied the longer he sat with them, and a growing uncomfortable awareness that he had perhaps been too quick to accept the narrative offered to him by others, rather than seeking the truth directly from the one person who could have told him plainly, had he only asked with genuine care rather than cold suspicion. Meanwhile, in the servants' quarters below stairs, whispers of their own had begun to circulate. Hannah, still shaken from finding the Duchess collapsed on the landing, confided quietly to the head housekeeper what she had overheard through the closed door of Eleanor's chambers, the word pregnancy spoken softly but unmistakably. The housekeeper, a woman of considerable discretion built over decades of service to great households, cautioned Hannah sternly against repeating such things, but the knowledge, once spoken aloud even in whispers, had a way of finding its own paths through a household as large as Ashworth House, regardless of how carefully anyone tried to contain it. By the following morning, though no one spoke of it openly in Julian's presence, a quiet undercurrent of anticipation had settled among the staff, a sense that something significant was shifting within the family, even if its exact shape remained unclear to those below stairs. Eleanor woke that morning still weak but clearer of mind than she had been in days, the enforced rest having done at least some good for her strength, if not for her peace of mind. Dr. Grant visited early to check on her condition, pleased to find her color improved and her pulse steadier than the previous day. "You gave everyone quite a scare," he said gently, taking a seat beside her bed, "myself included, if I am honest, Your Grace." "I did not intend to collapse in front of half the household," Eleanor said, a faint, tired humor creeping into her voice despite everything. "Though I suppose the secret is no longer entirely mine to keep." "No," Alistair agreed. "I am sorry that the truth came out as it did. You deserved the chance to tell the Duke in your own words, in your own time. It cannot be helped now." Eleanor shifted slightly against her pillows, wincing at the lingering soreness from her fall. "Constance was there, in the room, when you spoke. I saw her face before she left." Alistair's expression grew troubled. "I noticed as well. I do not like what her presence there might mean for how quickly this information travels beyond these walls." "Nor do I," Eleanor admitted, "though there is little I can do about it now, weak as I am." "Rest is the only remedy I can offer at present," Alistair said, "for your body, if not for your worries. I will continue to visit daily until I am satisfied you and the child are both entirely well." He left shortly after, promising to return by evening, and Eleanor lay alone in the quiet of her chambers, listening to the distant sounds of the household continuing its ordinary rhythms below, wondering how much longer those rhythms would remain undisturbed before Julian finally came to her with the truth laid bare between them, no longer a secret she alone carried, but a fact the entire household now seemed to share in some fragmented, whispered form. Julian did not sleep well that night, his mind circling endlessly around his mother's cryptic warning and the memory of Constance's carefully timed suggestion in the stables, two conversations that sat uneasily together the more he turned them over. By morning, he had resolved to speak with his mother plainly, whatever she was hesitant to share. He found her in the breakfast room, alone, the morning light catching the silver in her hair as she sat with a cup of tea before her, untouched. "Mother," he said, closing the door behind him. "You said there were things I did not understand. I would like you to explain them now." Margaret studied her son for a long moment before setting down her cup. "Sit, Julian." He obeyed, some instinct telling him this conversation would reshape everything he thought he understood about the past several weeks. "Your wife has been carrying a heavy burden alone," Margaret began. "One she chose to hide from you, though I do not believe her reasons were what you might assume." "What burden?" Margaret held his gaze steadily. "Eleanor is with child, Julian. Your child. She has known for several weeks." The words landed like a physical blow, and Julian sat back in his chair, momentarily unable to form a response. The morning light through the window seemed suddenly too bright, the quiet clink of his mother's abandoned teacup too loud against the silence that followed her announcement. He thought of the countless conversations of recent weeks, replaying each one against this new understanding, watching old certainties crumble and reform into something entirely different. He thought of the solicitor's papers sitting in his desk drawer, half completed, waiting only for his final signature to set the annulment fully in motion. He thought of every cold word he had spoken to Eleanor over recent weeks, every assumption he had made about her distance, her secrecy, her supposed indifference to their marriage. None of it had been indifference at all. It had been fear, the same fear he recognized now in himself, fear of trusting. Fear of being made vulnerable to disappointment. "How could I not have noticed?" he said, more to himself than to his mother. 2 years married to her, and I could not see what was happening beneath my own roof. "You were not looking, Julian, because you had already decided what you expected to find," Margaret said, not unkindly, though the words carried their own quiet weight of truth. "It is a common enough failing, though no less costly for its familiarity. We see what we expect to see, and rarely think to question whether our expectations themselves might be flawed. That is not possible." She said nothing, weeks of nothing, while I discussed annulment papers in front of her, while I accused her of impropriety with the doctor, and she said nothing? Because she believed, and rightly so given your recent behavior, that if she told you, you would think she meant to trap you with the child, to force your hand at the exact moment you were trying to leave, Margaret said, her tone firm despite its gentleness. "You gave her no reason to trust that you would believe her timing was honest, Julian. You had already decided to end things before she even knew herself." Julian's mind raced backward through the recent weeks, through Eleanor's pallor, her sudden aversion to wine and long rides, her private meetings with Dr. Grant that he had so quickly assumed were something improper. All of it, viewed through this new understanding, painted an entirely different picture than the one Constance had so carefully suggested to him. He thought of the morning he had announced his intention to end their marriage, the way Eleanor had gone so quiet, so carefully composed, when he had expected either tears or anger. He understood now what that composure had cost her. Standing before him with a secret already forming within her, listening to him speak of solicitors and annulment papers while she carried news that should have changed the entire conversation, had circumstances allowed her to share it. "How long," he asked his mother, "did you say she has known?" "Several weeks, I believe, though you would need to ask her directly for the precise timing." "Before I announced my intentions, then?" "I could not say for certain, but given what little I know of when these things typically become confirmed, it seems likely she learned of the child very close to the same time you made your announcement, perhaps even that very morning." Margaret's expression softened with something close to sympathy for her son's evident distress. "Which means, Julian, that she has carried this knowledge through every difficult conversation between you since, every accusation, every cold silence, entirely alone." The weight of that realization settled over Julian like a physical burden. He thought of the confrontation in his study, his accusations about her meetings with the doctor, and understood now with painful clarity exactly what those meetings had been about, and exactly how unjust his suspicions had been. "The doctor," he said slowly. "She was meeting with him because of the child." "Yes." Shame settled heavily in his chest, mixing uncomfortably with the shock still working its way through him. He had accused his wife of dishonesty and impropriety while she had been quietly, painfully, protecting a secret meant to shield them both from a decision made in doubt rather than certainty. "Why did you not tell me sooner?" he asked his mother. "Because it was not my truth to tell. I only learned of it myself yesterday, when Eleanor fainted." Margaret's expression darkened slightly. "And there is more you should know, my son, about who else was present when the truth came out, and what she may have done with that knowledge since. Constance. She was there. She left the room quickly, before anyone thought to consider why, and within the hour, she found you in the stables, urging you to proceed quickly with the annulment, before, as she put it, matters grew more complicated." Julian's jaw tightened as the full shape of the manipulation became clear to him. Weeks of careful whispers, of doubts planted at precisely the right moments, of a physician's routine visits twisted into something scandalous, all of it now visible as a deliberate campaign rather than a series of unfortunate coincidences. Why would she do this? Ask yourself who benefits most from your marriage ending quickly, before certain facts come to light, Margaret said quietly. Her daughter has been waiting patiently at their family estate for an opportunity such as this. I do not believe that waiting has been idle. Julian rose from his chair, anger and shame warring within him, though beneath both emotions ran something else, something that felt dangerously close to hope. A child, his child. And Eleanor, who had carried this alone through weeks of his coldness and suspicion, still choosing, even in her hurt, to protect the truth from being used as a weapon by either side. "There is something else you should understand," Margaret added, before he could leave the room. "Eleanor did not stay silent out of any deception, Julian. She stayed silent because you gave her every reason to believe you would doubt her motives the moment she spoke. That is not a small thing to carry, and it is not a small thing to have caused, however unintentionally." "I understand that now," Julian said quietly, though understanding it does not undo the weeks she spent carrying that burden alone. "No," Margaret agreed, "it does not, but it can shape what comes next, if you allow it to." "I need to speak with her," he said. "She may not be ready to hear from you yet. Not after everything," Margaret warned. "But I believe, my son, that you owe her the chance to say what she has been carrying alone for far too long." Julian found Eleanor in her chambers, sitting by the window with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her face turning toward him with a wary caution the moment he entered. "Julian," she said carefully, "I did not expect you. My mother told me everything." He crossed the room slowly, stopping a respectful distance away, uncertain of his welcome. "About the child, about why you kept it from me." Eleanor's composure wavered, the careful mask she had worn for weeks finally beginning to crack. "I wanted to tell you myself, in my own words, at a time I chose, not like this." "I know." Julian sank into the chair across from her, his earlier certainty entirely gone, replaced by something far more uncertain and far more honest. "I have spent this morning realizing how much of what I believed these past weeks was built on doubts someone else planted in me, carefully and deliberately." "Constance." "Yes." His expression hardened briefly before softening again as he looked at her. "I owe you an apology far larger than words can properly hold, Eleanor. I accused you of dishonesty while you were protecting a truth that should have brought us together, not driven us apart." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears she had held back for weeks, tears of exhaustion, of relief, of grief for all the pain that might have been avoided had trust existed between them from the beginning. "I was afraid," she admitted. "Afraid that if I told you, you would believe I meant to trap you, to force you to stay out of obligation rather than choice. I understand that fear now. I gave you every reason to believe it justified." Julian reached across the small distance between them and, hesitantly, took her hand in his. "But I want you to know, Eleanor, whatever doubts I carried into this marriage, whatever coldness I allowed to grow between us these past months, none of it changes what I feel now, learning that you carry my child, and that you protected that truth even while I gave you every reason to distrust me." "What do you feel now?" Eleanor asked quietly, searching his face. Julian was quiet for a long moment, searching for words honest enough to match the weight of the question. "I feel like a man who nearly threw away something worth keeping, out of fear and pride and the careful manipulations of someone I trusted far more than I should have. I feel like a father, Eleanor, for the first time in my life, and I do not intend to let that feeling slip away because of decisions made in doubt." Eleanor's tears fell freely now, though her expression carried something new beneath the sorrow, a fragile, cautious hope she had not allowed herself in weeks. "And the annulment?" "There will be no annulment," Julian said firmly. "Not now, not ever, if I have any say in the matter, and I intend to have quite a lot to say about it." Eleanor let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, relief washing through her so completely that fresh tears sprang to her eyes, though these carried none of the sorrow of before. "I did not know how much I needed to hear you say that," she admitted, "until you said it. I should have said it weeks ago, before doubt and pride had the chance to do so much damage between us." Julian shifted closer, still holding her hand, his thumb tracing gentle patterns against her knuckles as though he needed the physical contact to fully believe the moment was real. "I want you to know, Eleanor, that whatever led me to the decision I announced that morning at breakfast, it was never truly about you lacking worth as a wife. It was about my own fear of a marriage I did not choose for myself, a fear I allowed to curdle into coldness, rather than ever giving you the chance to prove it unfounded." "I understand fear better than I once did," Eleanor said quietly. "I have lived with little else these past weeks, wondering how to tell you the truth, wondering whether you would believe my timing was honest." "I believe you," Julian said again, as though the words needed repeating to fully settle into truth between them. "And I intend to spend a great deal of time earning back whatever trust I damaged, however long that takes." They sat together a while longer, the conversation gradually softening from confession and apology into something gentler. Questions about how she had been feeling, what the doctor had told her about the months ahead, small, ordinary details of a pregnancy that Julian realized, with a fresh pang of guilt, he had missed the chance to share in from its very beginning. Eleanor answered his questions patiently, watching something shift visibly in him with each new detail she offered, watching the careful, guarded Duke she had married slowly give way to a man who looked, for the first time in longer than she could recall, genuinely present in the moment rather than distant behind some invisible wall. "I feared, in the earliest days after my father passed, that I would never learn to trust my own judgment in matters of the heart," Julian continued, his voice quieter now, more reflective than she had heard it in a very long time. "He taught me a great many things about managing an estate, about honoring obligations, about the weight of the Ashworth name. He taught me very little about how to recognize genuine affection when it was offered to me, or how to offer it in return without fearing I was making myself vulnerable to disappointment." "And now?" Eleanor asked softly. "Now I think I have spent 2 years mistaking caution for wisdom, when in truth it was simply fear wearing a more respectable face." He tightened his hold on her hand gently. "I do not wish to spend the rest of our marriage governed by that same fear, Eleanor. I would rather risk vulnerability and be proven wrong on occasion than continue guarding myself so carefully that I nearly lose everything worth keeping." Eleanor studied his face for a long moment, searching for any sign that his words were spoken merely from guilt or obligation rather than genuine feeling, and found instead something that looked remarkably like sincerity, fragile and new, but present nonetheless. "I do not expect everything to be mended in a single conversation," she said carefully. "Trust, once damaged, takes time to rebuild. I learned that lesson well these past weeks." "I do not expect it either," Julian agreed. "But I would like the chance to try, if you are willing to grant it." "I am willing," Eleanor said, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could easily remember, a genuine easing of the tension that had lived in her chest for so many weeks. They sat together a while longer in comfortable silence, the rain having finally cleared outside, thin afternoon light beginning to filter through the window. Julian eventually rose, promising to return that evening, and paused at the door to look back at her. An expression on his face that Eleanor had not seen since the earliest days of their marriage, something open and unguarded that made her chest ache with cautious hope. Downstairs, unaware that her carefully constructed plans had just begun to unravel entirely, Lady Constance sat in the drawing room composing a letter to her daughter, filled with confident assurances that matters at Ashworth House were proceeding exactly as intended. She wrote of patience rewarded, of opportunities soon to present themselves, entirely unaware that in the room above her, the very foundation of her careful scheme was already crumbling beyond any hope of repair. She would not remain unaware for long. The reckoning came swiftly, and it came in front of the entire household. Julian summoned everyone to the great hall the following afternoon, a gathering unusual enough that whispers had already begun circulating among the staff by the time the family assembled. Margaret stood near the fireplace, her expression composed but watchful. Eleanor sat in a chair near the window, still weak from the previous days but steady enough to be present for what was about to unfold. Dr. Alistair Grant lingered near the doorway, uncertain of his role in the proceedings but present at Eleanor's quiet request. Constance arrived last, her expression carefully arranged into polite curiosity, though something in her eyes suggested she already sensed the ground shifting beneath her. "I have called you all here," Julian began, his voice steady and carrying easily through the hall, "to address matters that have caused considerable harm within this household. Harm I allowed to happen through my own doubt and poor judgment, but harm that was deliberately encouraged by someone I trusted." Constance's composure flickered, though she said nothing, waiting. "For weeks, I believed my marriage was built on nothing but obligation and cold distance," Julian continued. "I was encouraged in that belief by carefully chosen words, timed suggestions, and doubts planted at precisely the moments they would do the most damage. I was told my wife met privately and improperly with our physician, when in truth she was protecting a secret meant to spare us both unnecessary pain, a secret concerning a child we are soon to welcome into this family." A murmur rippled through the gathered staff, quickly silenced by Margaret's sharp glance. "I was encouraged, more than once, to proceed quickly with ending my marriage, before, as I was told, matters grew more complicated," Julian went on, his gaze settling directly on Constance now. "I understand now precisely what those complications would have been, and precisely who benefited most from my ignorance of them." "Julian, cousin, I do not know what you are suggesting," Constance said, her voice carrying a thin edge of forced calm. "I am suggesting nothing," Julian replied evenly. "I am stating plainly what my mother has confirmed, what the timing of your comments and your daughter's continued presence at your family estate, waiting for an opportunity such as this, make entirely clear. You sought to end my marriage before I could learn the truth of my wife's condition, believing that once the marriage was dissolved, your own daughter might find a place within this family that Eleanor's continued presence would otherwise prevent." The silence in the hall grew heavy and absolute. "That is a serious accusation," Constance said, though her voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. "It is," Julian agreed, "and I do not make it lightly, nor do I make it without cause." He glanced toward his mother, who stepped forward with the quiet authority of a woman who had spent decades managing the affairs of great households. "I have spoken with several members of the staff over these past days," Margaret said, her voice calm but unyielding. "Enough of them recall comments you made, timing that aligns precisely with each new doubt that found its way into my son's mind. I do not believe in coincidence, Constance, not when it serves one person's interests so consistently and so completely." Constance's carefully maintained composure finally cracked, her expression shifting from forced innocence to something far more bitter. "You have no true proof of any of this," she said, though the words carried little conviction. "Perhaps not proof enough for a court of law," Julian said, "but proof enough for this family, and proof enough that you no longer have a place within it. You will leave Ashworth House by the end of the week. I will provide for your daughter's prospects separately, as she bears no fault in her mother's schemes, but you, Constance, will no longer be welcome under this roof." Constance's gaze swept the room, searching for some ally, some sympathy, and finding none. Even the servants who had once treated her with the deference owed to family now regarded her with cool, careful distance. She drew herself up with what remained of her dignity and left the hall without another word, her footsteps echoing sharply against the stone floor until the great door closed behind her. For a long moment after Constance's departure, no one in the great hall spoke. The staff exchanged careful glances, uncertain whether the gathering had truly concluded or whether more remained to be said. Margaret moved quietly among them, murmuring brief reassurances, dismissing the household back to their usual duties with the calm authority of a woman who had managed such moments many times before, though rarely with stakes quite so personal to her own family. Dr. Alistair Grant remained near the doorway a while longer, watching the family reassemble itself in the aftermath of the confrontation, feeling the particular satisfaction of a man who had kept a difficult confidence and seen it, eventually, lead to justice rather than further harm. He caught Eleanor's eye across the hall and offered a small, warm smile, which she returned gratefully before he took his own leave, understanding instinctively that the family required privacy now more than his continued presence. The tension in the room eased slowly, replaced by something quieter, more fragile. Julian crossed the hall to where Eleanor sat and knelt beside her chair, taking her hand gently in his. "I am sorry," he said, low enough that the words felt meant only for her, though the room had not fully returned to its normal murmur. "For every doubt I allowed to take root, for every accusation I made without cause, for every week you carried this alone because I gave you no reason to trust otherwise." "You could not have known what Constance was doing," Eleanor said softly, though her voice carried no true absolution, only honest acknowledgement. "But you could have asked me directly, rather than assuming the worst based on whispers." "You are right to hold me accountable for that," Julian said. "I let pride and old fears guide my judgment, when I should have simply come to you and asked. I will not make that mistake again, Eleanor. Whatever difficulties arise between us in the years ahead, and I imagine there will be some, I promise you I will bring my doubts to you directly rather than allowing them to fester in silence, fed by whoever happens to be nearby with a convenient explanation." Eleanor studied his face, searching for any trace of the cold, guarded man who had announced the end of their marriage only weeks earlier, and found instead something new, an openness she had glimpsed only briefly during their wedding night, now returning with a steadiness that gave her genuine hope for what might follow. "You believe me now," Eleanor said softly. "That matters more than I can properly express." "I believe you," Julian said, "and I intend to spend considerably more effort earning the trust I so carelessly damaged these past months." He glanced down at her still gentle stomach, wonder crossing his features in a way Eleanor had never seen from him before. "A child," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Our child. Our child," Eleanor confirmed, and for the first time in weeks, allowed herself a genuine smile. Margaret watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction, though her attention soon turned to Dr. Alistair Grant, who remained near the doorway, uncertain whether his presence was still needed. "Doctor," she said, approaching him, "thank you for your discretion these past weeks, and your care for my daughter-in-law. This family owes you a debt of gratitude." "I only did what any physician would do, Your Grace," Alistair said modestly. "Perhaps," Margaret allowed, "but not every physician would have shown such patience and loyalty under difficult circumstances. Should you ever need anything from this family, you need only ask." Alistair thanked her warmly and took his leave shortly after, promising to return the following week to check on Eleanor's continued progress. As he made his way down the front steps toward his waiting carriage, he reflected on the strange, difficult weeks that had led to this resolution, grateful that his careful discretion had ultimately served the family well, rather than the alternative he had quietly feared, that his silence might somehow contribute to further harm, rather than eventual healing. He had walked a careful line between his duty to his patient and his own sense of what was right, and he allowed himself, for the first time in weeks, to feel satisfied with how that balance had ultimately resolved itself. Behind him, in the great hall, the family remained a while longer, the formal gathering having dissolved into something quieter and more intimate. Margaret eventually excused herself as well, sensing that her son and daughter-in-law required privacy to begin the long process of rebuilding what recent months had so nearly destroyed. In the weeks that followed, the household slowly settled into a new rhythm, one built on honesty rather than the careful, cold distance that had defined the early months of Julian and Eleanor's marriage. Julian found himself lingering at breakfast again, asking after Eleanor's health with genuine concern, spending evenings in her company rather than retreating to his study out of habit or discomfort. The solicitor's papers were quietly withdrawn, the annulment proceedings abandoned entirely, replaced instead by a growing warmth between husband and wife that neither had expected to find, given how close they had come to losing it entirely. Constance departed Ashworth House within the week, as promised. Her plans for her daughter's future within the family dissolved along with her own place in it. Her daughter, it was later learned, found a respectable match through more honest means, unburdened by her mother's schemes. A small mercy that even Margaret privately admitted was a fairer outcome than Constance herself deserved. Eleanor's strength returned gradually, her color restored, her sickness easing as the weeks passed, and the child within her continued to grow steady and strong. Julian accompanied her on gentle walks through the garden each afternoon, a habit that became, in time, one of the quiet foundations of the marriage they were slowly, carefully rebuilding. "I used to think duty and love were separate things," Julian admitted one evening as they sat together by the fire, Eleanor's hand resting comfortably in his. "That one could exist without the other, that I had married for duty, and nothing more would ever grow from it." "And now?" Eleanor asked. "Now I think duty was simply where we began," Julian said, "not where we were meant to end." Eleanor rested her head against his shoulder, the warmth between them no longer a memory from a single wedding night, but a steady, growing presence that filled the halls of Ashworth House with a peace it had not known in a long while. In the weeks that followed the confrontation in the Great Hall, Julian threw himself into the work of rebuilding what had so nearly been lost, not through grand gestures, which he suspected Eleanor would have found hollow given everything they had endured, but through small, consistent acts that gradually rebuilt the trust his earlier coldness had eroded. He asked after her health each morning, and meant the question genuinely. He accompanied her to appointments with Dr. Grant, listening carefully to every detail of the pregnancy's progress, asking questions he would once have considered beneath his notice. He began, slowly, to share more of himself with her as well, the burdens of managing the estate, the worries that kept him awake some nights, worries he had once kept carefully guarded even from his own wife. Eleanor, for her part, found herself gradually lowering the careful walls she had built during the loneliest months of their marriage, allowing herself to trust the warmth Julian now offered, though she remained watchful, unwilling to fully surrender the caution that had protected her through so much uncertainty. Trust, she had learned, could not be rebuilt through words alone, but through the accumulation of small, consistent proofs offered over time, and she found, to her quiet relief, that Julian seemed to understand this as well, never growing impatient with her occasional hesitance, never expecting the damage of recent months to mend itself overnight. Margaret watched the slow transformation of her son and daughter-in-law with quiet satisfaction, though she took care not to intrude too heavily on their rebuilding, offering support when asked and stepping back when her presence was not needed. She had feared, during the darkest weeks of Constance's manipulations, that she might lose not only a daughter-in-law she had grown genuinely fond of, but the last hope of warmth returning to a household that had grown increasingly cold since her husband's passing years earlier. Watching Julian laugh freely at dinner again, watching Eleanor's color return along with her cautious happiness, Margaret allowed herself, for the first time in a long while, to believe that Ashworth House might yet become the home she had always hoped it could be. News of Constance's departure spread through the wider social circles of their acquaintance within weeks, accompanied by careful, vague explanations offered by Margaret that protected the family's reputation, while making clear enough that Constance's welcome at Ashworth House had ended permanently. Few pressed for further details, sensing correctly that the matter was not meant for open discussion, though whispers of scandal followed Constance regardless. Whispers she found considerably harder to escape than she had once made Eleanor's own reputation suffer through careful, deniable suggestion. Eleanor thought of her often in quiet moments, not with anger, which had faded gradually into something closer to weary understanding, but with a kind of distant pity for a woman who had allowed ambition for her daughter to curdle into cruelty toward people who had never truly wronged her. She hoped, in her more generous moments, that Constance might find some measure of peace wherever she settled next, though she did not spend much time dwelling on the hope, her attention increasingly consumed by the growing life within her and the slowly mending marriage that surrounded it. As the weeks passed into months, the change in Ashworth House became unmistakable to everyone who lived within its walls. The formal, careful distance that had once characterized every interaction between the Duke and Duchess gave way gradually to genuine warmth, evident in small moments the staff noted quietly among themselves. Julian's hand resting naturally at the small of Eleanor's back as they walked together through the halls, Eleanor's laughter carrying more freely through rooms that had once felt heavy with unspoken tension, evening conversations by the fire that stretched long past their usual hour, neither of them eager to retreat to separate rooms as they once had without a second thought. Whatever trials had brought them to this moment, both understood now that the true story of their marriage was only just beginning. Winter had settled fully over Ashworth House by the time Eleanor's labor began, snow gathering thick along the garden paths where she and Julian had walked together so many quiet evenings in the months before. The birth was long and difficult, and for several hours, Julian paced the corridor outside her chambers with a fear he had never known before, not even in the darkest days of their earlier estrangement. Margaret sat with him for much of that time, her steady presence a quiet comfort as the hours stretched on, the sound of Eleanor's labor carrying faintly through the closed door. Dr. Alistair Grant attended the birth personally, refusing to leave Eleanor's side despite the late hour, his calm competence a steadying force in a household otherwise gripped with anxious waiting. When the cry of a newborn finally broke the tense silence of the house, Julian was on his feet before the sound had fully faded, his hand already reaching for the door before Margaret gently caught his arm. "Give them a moment, my son," she said softly, though her own eyes shone with unshed tears of relief and joy. When Julian was finally allowed inside, he found Eleanor pale but smiling, exhausted beyond words yet radiant, in a way he had never seen before, a small bundle held carefully against her chest. "A daughter," Eleanor said softly, as he crossed the room and knelt beside the bed. Healthy and strong, according to the doctor. Julian looked down at the tiny face, red and wrinkled and entirely unbothered by the tremendous fear and hope that had gathered around her arrival, and felt something shift permanently within him, a certainty deeper than any doubt Constance had ever managed to plant. "She is perfect," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion he made no effort to hide. "What shall we name her?" Eleanor asked. Julian considered the question for a long moment, watching the small, sleeping face. "Grace," he said finally. "Given everything that nearly kept us from this moment, I think we owe her name to the grace that brought us through it." Eleanor smiled and shifted the baby slightly so Julian could take her, hesitant hands finally growing steady as he cradled his daughter for the first time. The months that followed transformed Ashworth House in ways that went far beyond the arrival of a child. The cold formality that had once defined the great halls softened into something warmer, filled now with the small sounds of a growing family, laughter shared over breakfast, evenings spent together by the fire rather than in separate, distant rooms. Margaret doted openly on her granddaughter, spending long afternoons in the nursery, teaching Eleanor the small traditions of the household that had passed through generations of Ashworth mothers before her. The distance that had once existed between Eleanor and her mother-in-law had long since dissolved into genuine affection, a bond forged through the trials of the previous year, and strengthened by the shared joy of Grace's arrival. Dr. Alistair Grant remained a trusted friend to the family long after his professional duties concluded, often visiting simply to see how young Grace was growing, welcomed warmly by a household that had come to see him as far more than a physician who had once kept a difficult secret. On one such visit, nearly a year after Grace's birth, Alistair found Julian in the garden, watching Eleanor walk slowly along the rose paths with their daughter balanced on her hip, the child reaching curious hands toward every blossom within reach. "You look content, Your Grace," Alistair observed, coming to stand beside him. "I am," Julian said simply, "more content than I believed possible, not so very long ago." He glanced at the doctor with a rueful smile. "I owe you a debt I do not think I can properly repay, Doctor. Your discretion, your patience with all of us during those difficult weeks. It mattered more than I fully understood at the time." "You owe me nothing beyond what you have already given," Alistair replied. "The friendship of this family has been reward enough, and watching young Grace grow into such a lively, happy child brings its own satisfaction that no payment could improve upon." They stood together a while longer, watching Eleanor and Grace continue their slow progress through the garden, the late afternoon sun casting long, warm shadows across the lawn, before Alistair took his leave, promising to return again soon, as he so often did now, not as a physician attending a difficult case, but as a welcomed friend of the family. Of Constance, little was heard in the years that followed. She settled quietly at a distant relation's estate, her ambitions for her daughter's future within the Ashworth family long since abandoned. Her daughter, freed from her mother's schemes, went on to make a respectable and genuinely happy match through her own honest efforts, a fact that Margaret occasionally noted with quiet satisfaction whenever the subject arose. News reached Ashworth House only rarely of Constance's circumstances in the years that followed, carried through the distant, indirect channels of extended family correspondence rather than any direct contact. She was said to live modestly, her once considerable influence within their social circle diminished significantly by the quiet manner in which her departure from Ashworth House had been explained to those who asked. Margaret, when the subject arose during family gatherings, offered only measured, careful responses that neither condemned nor excused what had transpired, believing firmly that the matter had been settled satisfactorily within their own walls and required no further public accounting. Eleanor found, with the passage of time, that her own feelings toward Constance had softened into something closer to indifference than the sharp hurt she had once carried. She had a daughter to raise, a marriage to nurture, A household to manage alongside a husband who had become, in the years since Grace's birth, a genuine partner rather than the distant figure he had once seemed destined to remain. There was little room left in her heart for old grievances when so much genuine happiness now filled her days. The rift that had once nearly ended her marriage became, in time, simply a difficult chapter in a much longer story, one she and Julian occasionally revisited during quiet evening conversations, not with pain, but with the particular gratitude of two people who understood how narrowly they had avoided losing everything that now brought them such contentment. Julian, for his part, became a different man in the years following Grace's birth, the guarded coldness that had once defined him softening into a warmth that extended not only to his wife and daughter, but to the entire household under his care. He often told Eleanor, in quiet moments by the fire, that he could not imagine now how close he had come to losing the very things that had come to matter most to him. "You once told me," Eleanor reminded him one evening, watching him hold their daughter, now old enough to reach small, curious hands toward his face, that our marriage had never truly been one. That it existed only as duty. "I remember," Julian said, smiling down at Grace before looking up to meet Eleanor's eyes. "I was a fool, and nearly a very unhappy one, had matters gone differently. And now I cannot imagine a truer marriage than the one we have built since," he said simply. "Duty brought us together, Eleanor, but it was honesty, and perhaps a little grace, that made us a family." Grace, now old enough to toddle unsteadily across the drawing-room floor with Margaret's watchful assistance, let out a delighted squeal at some private joy of her own, drawing both her parents' attention and a shared, easy laugh that filled the room with warmth. Margaret caught Eleanor's eye across the room and smiled. A smile that carried within it years of quiet worry finally settled into contentment. "She grows more like you each week," Margaret said to Eleanor, scooping Grace up as the child made a determined lunge toward the fireplace. "Stubborn, and utterly certain of what she wants, whatever obstacles stand in her way. I take that as the highest compliment, given how well things turned out despite my own stubbornness," Eleanor replied, watching her daughter squirm happily in Margaret's arms. Julian rose and crossed the room to take Grace from his mother, settling his daughter against his shoulder with the easy confidence of a father well practiced in such small tasks, a confidence that would have seemed impossible to imagine in the guarded, distant man he had been before her birth. Grace patted his cheek with small, insistent hands, babbling contentedly, and Julian pressed a gentle kiss to the top of her head before returning to his seat beside Eleanor. "I used to believe," he said quietly, watching his daughter settle drowsily against him, "that a house like this one could only ever be a place of duty and formality, the kind of household my father built and expected me to continue without question. I did not imagine it could feel like this." "Like what?" Eleanor asked, leaning into his shoulder. "Like home," Julian said simply. "A true one, filled with people who choose each other, again and again, rather than simply enduring an arrangement neither had a hand in choosing." Outside, the gardens of Ashworth House bloomed fully into spring once more, the roses climbing along the same stone walls where Margaret had once sat with Eleanor, during the darkest weeks of her fear, where Constance had once whispered her careful schemes, and where now, on warm afternoons, Julian and Eleanor walked together with their daughter between them, the past finally settled into memory, and the future stretching ahead of them, bright and entirely their own. Outside, the gardens of Ashworth House bloomed fully into spring once more, the roses climbing along the same stone walls where Margaret had once sat with Eleanor during the darkest weeks of her fear, where Constance had once whispered her careful schemes, and where now, on warm afternoons, Julian and Eleanor walked together with their daughter between them, the past finally settled into memory, and the future stretching ahead of them, bright and entirely their own.